Well, hello and welcome to the Stone Church Bible Study. Those of you who are in the Catholic or Anglican or Lutheran tradition will probably be very familiar with the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed. These are affirmations of faith that we recite pretty much every Sunday morning and that you may recite every time you say private prayers. But you may be surprised to learn that there are actually older creedal statements than this, one of which is actually found in the New Testament. Specifically, it's found in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at this very, very early creed. And what this creed shows us is that from the very beginning, the early church had a strong belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So, with that in mind, let's get started. So we're going to be taking a look at Paul's teaching on the resurrection from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 to 11. So here Paul writes, Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time. In fact, a lot of people have suggested that this is kind of a proto-creed that was circulating in the churches of the first century. A creed is basically a short statement of belief that was meant to be memorized, it's meant to be learned by heart, and you'll notice that this particular creed has a kind of rhythm to it. So if you focus in there on verses 3 to 8, you'll notice that the phrase "and that" appears several times. And also the word "then" appears several times. So it almost sounds like it has this natural rhythm and cadence to it. Now, before I do get into the nuts and bolts of the creed, I want to explain why Paul addresses the doctrine of the resurrection in his first letter to the Corinthians. Some of the Christians in Corinth were saying that there is no resurrection of the dead. So they didn't have a problem at all with the belief in life after death. They could easily imagine Jesus, say for example, returning as a spirit, returning as a ghost to encounter the disciples. They had no problem believing that one day they themselves would continue to exist eternally, perhaps in a spiritual or non-corporeal state, right? What they had trouble believing in, these Corinthian Christians, was this idea that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. They also had a hard time believing that there was a general physical resurrection of the dead. The idea of the body rising to a new form of life in a higher state of being was something that was hard for them to get their heads around. And I think the same is true for today. Like, you ask the average person, a lot of people believe in an afterlife of some sort. A lot of people believe in ghosts or spirits, that sort of thing. But once you start asking them, is there a physical resurrection of the dead? Well, you might get a very different response. Anyway, Paul is responding to this issue because, Paul knows, of course, that bodily resurrection is really at the heart of the Christian faith. It's at the heart of his teaching. And he really wants to affirm this. And so Paul, in verse 3 of chapter 15, writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures." I want to focus on the first part of that verse. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Paul states that when he first encountered the Corinthians, when he first showed up in Corinth, when he first began to preach and teach the message, when he first began to gather a community of believers, he shared this particular creedal statement with them. Maybe he even had them memorize it as part of their discipleship. And Paul then says something really interesting. He says that at one point in time, he himself received this message. Now the question is, from whom? Well, we know that Paul claimed to be an eyewitness of Christ's resurrection. So he saw the resurrected Christ, the risen Christ, with his own eyes. So we could possibly conclude that Paul received this teaching from the Lord himself. However, the formal doctrine of the bodily resurrection, the actual creedal confession, could have come to Paul from others. So Richard B. Hayes, he's the New Testament scholar I just mentioned, along with a number of other different New Testament scholars, suggests that Paul received this message, this creed, from some of the other apostles, i.e. Peter and James, who themselves were eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And this makes total sense to me. According to what he writes in his letter to the Galatians, we know that Paul visited the apostles in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. This is what Paul writes in Galatians. He says, "Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas." Cephas is the Aramaic name for Peter. "I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, and I stayed with him 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother." So, 3 years after his conversion, Paul heads up to Jerusalem and spends 2 weeks with James and Peter. And I wish I was there. Like, imagine the conversations those 3 men would have had with one another. It's unlikely that the 3 of them were just sitting around talking about the weather in Jerusalem. I'm willing to bet that Paul asked questions about the resurrected Christ. And he would have said, "Look, you saw him too? Well, what did he look like? Did he show you his scars? What were the scars like?" And it's also possible that Paul learned by heart this really early creedal confession on the resurrection, that he actually learned it from James and Peter. And if Peter and James taught this creedal confession to Paul, then just imagine how old this creedal confession actually is. So let's try to date it, right? So let's say that Paul had his Damascus Road experience roughly 33 or 34 AD. That's when most people, for whatever reason, date the Damascus Road experience as. 33 or 34 AD. Now, he met with Peter and James, by his own admission, 3 years later, so that would put the year 36 or 37 AD. And if Paul received this creedal affirmation during this meeting, we know that that creedal affirmation dates back to earlier. It's unlikely that they just made it up during the course of those 2 weeks, right? So it's even older than that. So in short, this creedal statement can be dated to a few years after Jesus' actual crucifixion and resurrection. And maybe we're looking at a window of, I don't know, like 3 to 7 years or something like that. So this is a very, very old confession of faith. So what it shows is that the early Christians believed in the bodily resurrection of Christ from the very beginning. I mean, some people might try to convince you that this was a later development in the early church, that it came along a couple of generations after the first generation of Christians. No, right from the get-go, the early Christians believed that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead, which I think is really striking. And then continuing, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 4, "And that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures." Here's an interesting question. Why does this really early creed affirm that Jesus was buried? Because isn't burial implied by death? Why include that particular detail? So if I mentioned to you that my great aunt died last week, you wouldn't stop and think, "Oh, was she buried too?" No, I mean, the implication is in her death that either she has already been buried or will be buried. Now, it could be that the early Christians wished to emphasize that Jesus really was truly dead, that he actually died on the cross. And mentioning the burial really emphasizes that point. So when I say that somebody died, the meaning is clear. But if I say he's dead and buried, it makes it even clearer. Like I'm really affirming the fact that the person is now dead. And it could be that the people who formulated this creed really wanted to emphasize that Jesus was dead. They wanted perhaps to refute the claim that some people may have been making that Jesus didn't really die, that basically he was rendered unconscious and he revived again 3 days later in the cool of the tomb. But the creed affirms here, no, he was dead. He was actually clinically dead. His body was dead. However, and this is another interesting point, the reference to the burial could also be a very subtle reference to the story of the empty tomb that's found in the 4 Gospels. We all know the story, of course. The women, followers of Jesus, went to the tomb on Sunday morning. They went to anoint the body, but instead of finding a corpse, they find that the tomb is empty. So mention of Jesus' burial in this creed would have reminded the early Christians of that empty tomb story that was definitely circulating in the church at the time. So the creed actually that we see here doesn't mention the women encountering Jesus at the tomb. Okay, it mentions other people encountering the risen Christ, but not the women. But it could be that this reference to the burial is a subtle way of reminding people of that story. Paul also mentions that, quoting the creed, says that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. And by the Scriptures, we mean the Old Testament, of course, or the Hebrew Bible. So do the Hebrew Scriptures speak of the resurrection of the Messiah? Well, according to Peter, yes. In Acts chapter 2, Peter is preaching and he quotes a Psalm of David. He says, quoting the Psalm, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One experience corruption." And Peter says, look, these words were spoken prophetically by King David, and King David was pointing towards his descendant, the Messiah, who would live forever. And this is exactly what Peter says. He says, "Our ancestor David both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Since he was a prophet, he knew that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would put one of his descendants on his throne. Foreseeing this, David spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah." So yes, it's possible to point to the Old Testament and see, in hindsight as it were, references to a resurrected Messiah. However, as N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, has argued, the Old Testament does speak of the resurrection of the Messiah, but in broad and sweeping ways, not necessarily in little phrases that you can pick and choose from the words of the prophets, etc. Then, moving on, this is 1 Corinthians 15:5, "And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Now, interestingly, it could have said, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he rose from the dead 3 days later, period. And this would be a very concise way of saying things. However, this particular creed emphasizes the fact that the risen Christ actually appeared before witnesses, many of whom, during the time of this letter's composition, were still alive. So the implication is really clear. If you doubt, if you disbelieve in this whole idea of bodily resurrection, well, there are still plenty of eyewitnesses still living among us, and you're welcome to go speak to them if you like. So this creed claims that Christ first appeared to Cephas. Again, that's Peter's Aramaic name. Only one of the Gospels, Luke's Gospels, attests to this private encounter between Jesus and Peter post-resurrection. So when, I'll tell you what that passage is, when the 2 disciples encounter Jesus on the road to Emmaus, you remember that story, of course, right? They run back to Jerusalem to tell the disciples who are in Jerusalem, and the other disciples then inform them that the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon. So there's that one little verse from Luke's Gospel that does in fact affirm that Peter had a private meeting with the resurrected Christ. This creed then mentions a meeting with 12 disciples altogether. And this definitely is affirmed in the gospel accounts of the resurrection. So in Luke's gospel and John's gospel, you'll remember that there's stories of Jesus appearing in the upper room with the disciples. That's when he allows the disciples to, see the nail marks on his hands and side, and apparently Thomas actually touches them and that sort of thing. Of course, you remember the story. This is interesting. Verse 6. Chapter 15, verse 6. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. You'll probably know that there's absolutely no story in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, that clearly states that the resurrected Christ appeared in front of 500 witnesses all at once. It's not there. However, a couple of New Testament scholars that I've looked into suggest that this could possibly be a reference to the story that's found at the end of Matthew's Gospel. So it's referred to as the Great Commission story. It's when Jesus addresses the disciples for the last time. Some see this as being possibly the occasion, although Matthew only speaks of 11 disciples in this particular story, rather than 500. At any rate, I think Paul's point is again obvious. If the Corinthians doubt the physical resurrection of Jesus, all they need to do is speak to a personal witness of the resurrected Christ, and there are many of them around. A lot of those 500 are still alive, and you can check in on them. N.T. Wright, the New Testament scholar, writes, the whole thrust of the paragraph is about evidence, about witnesses being called, about something that actually happened for which eyewitnesses could and would vouch. Paul would hardly call eyewitnesses for an experience which continued unabated, not least in Corinth itself. And then, it says in chapter 15, verse 7, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. James is probably a reference to Jesus' brother. Note that the Gospels do not speak of a personal encounter between James and the risen Christ. We don't hear about that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. However, it's very possible that that encounter did in fact take place. The Gospel of Luke, or is it Acts? I think it's Acts, clearly states that for a period of about 40 days, the risen Christ repeatedly had encounters with his disciples on and off. It's very possible that he saw James at this particular time and spoke to him. What we do know is that James, the brother of the Lord, was a key leader among the Christians in Jerusalem, even though he wasn't one of the 12 disciples, even though he wasn't a member of the inner circle. So a good explanation, therefore, for why he became a key leader in the Jerusalem church is this. Not only was James Jesus' brother, which would have counted for something, you would think, but he also had an encounter with the resurrected Christ. He actually, too, saw the risen Lord, which would have given him additional clout as well. If clout is the right word, maybe it's not. And then Paul states finally, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So Paul adds this little supplement to the creedal statement. He says, oh yeah, and there's me too. I'm also an eyewitness to the resurrected Lord. And this is interesting because here we have written, first-hand eyewitness confirmation of Christ's resurrection. It's actually quite remarkable, right? So the stories of Jesus' resurrection aren't just stories that we receive third, fourth, fifth hand. We have Paul himself, an eyewitness to the resurrection, actually saying, I saw him, and writing it down on papyrus. Paul describes himself, too, as an abnormal birth. I think the Greek phrase is, I'm probably butchering this, but to ektromati, which literally means to be born at the wrong time. So think of a premature baby, for example. That's how Paul imagines his birth as a Christian. He's kind of thrust out too early, blinded by this new reality that he's been exposed to. You remember that Paul, after his great conversion experience, is blind for a while, quite literally, right? But notice that here Paul is claiming to be a witness of the bodily resurrection. However, in Acts, the only account we have of Paul's encounter with Jesus is on his road to Damascus, where he sees a light. He doesn't see the risen Christ or touch his scars. Well, a couple of New Testament scholars that I've read have suggested that Paul had multiple encounters with Christ, not just the one on the road to Damascus. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. My personal belief is that Paul saw the resurrected Christ on at least a couple of occasions. And physically too, because that's clearly the idea that we get in his letters, that Paul physically saw the physically resurrected Christ.